In this section, I'm going to show you how we select elements on a site so that we can scrape certain elements. Say that we want to scrape this title up here with simple select of HTML element from a site. How do we select this element and basically get the data from a site? If you're already familiar with jQuery and CSS selectors, you can probably just skip this section and go straight ahead to the Craigslist scraper we do in the next section. But if you don't know these beginner basic stuff, then follow along and I will show you how to select elements. In order to select elements on an HTML page, we have to sort of know what kind of element is it and what kind of attribute does it have to be able to select it. So to look at the HTML code, you can go into the dots over here on the right side and go to More Tools and then Developer Tools. There's also a shortcut that is shown over here to the right side depending on if you're on Windows or Mac. Now if you click on that, we will open the Chrome Developer Tools. Here we have different tabs. The ones you're going to be using 95% of the time when you're scraping is going to be Elements, Console, and Network. But first, let's see how we select elements inside of an HTML page. So we can click on the select element to inspect it over here with the arrow, and then you can select elements on the side. So I can click on this one and then it gets highlighted inside the code here, and I can see what kind of element is this. I can see it is a H1 element, and down below we have the link, which is a element. And these things are gonna come in handy when we want to select elements and, for example, get the text that is inside them, such as simple select of HTML element. I also recommend that you go into an actual real site and try and fiddle around with this feature as well and see how it works, how it looks like. So I can go into Craigslist, which is a site we're going to scrape in another section. And you can click again on select element to inspect it and select different elements. See how they look like, how it looks like. So you can see, especially when we have a large site with a lot of HTML, this feature with selecting elements on a site as you see it is going to come in handy, because we're going to see in the code where this element is that we are pointing to. And I can see here it is a span element with the office commercial text inside, and outside there is a element with the link. These things are going to come in real handy when we want to select different elements inside the HTML. For example, let's say we are making such that our scraper is selecting all span elements that also has a element, and then we want to select the href property of this element to get the links to all of these different sections. That could be one thing you want to build a scraper for. There's a lot of opportunities and things you can do. Now, with that being said, I think it's time for us to start writing how we can actually select this element and get the text out inside of our console. So let's go ahead and select this element and get the output inside of a console tab. So open Chrome Developer Tools and select the console tab. Then write out this code here. Const a1 element is equal to document dot query selector and write in h1. And then let's see what the A1 element looks like. It is the HTML element that we selected using the H1 tag, or element tag, so to say. Now remember that when we looked inside of this element with the select or inspect element feature, we could see that it was an H1 element. So using that, we can then select the element and then we can output the text via the console. So we can say text content and then we have the text content of this H element. These things we can then use to execute inside of Node.js, so we can have a little script running on a server that goes to a page, and then it selects the element and gets the text. But there is a easier way of getting elements than doing all of this. Let me show you how to do that. We use jQuery selectors instead of these vanilla JavaScript selectors. So jQuery is a library for JavaScript that was quite popular some years ago. Now it's not so popular because we have things like React and Angular for making web apps. But we can still use jQuery to select elements, and it's quite handy to do that compared to using vanilla JavaScript selectors. So up here I have a little plugin that is injecting jQuery into a site. I do not have jQuery on this site already. Some pages already have jQuery in them, but you're going to come onto some sites that don't have jQuery installed already. So you can Google inject jQuery Chrome, and then there's this first result I have here, and you can just install that jQuery inject. Then up here I get this little handy extension plugin here where I can just click on it, and now jQuery is injected into this page, so I can use jQuery's features. So that means I can simply type in a $sign and then put in my CSS selector, which is going to be H1. And then you can put in a dot text to get the text from this element. See how easy that is? Compared to all of this where we first select the element and then we get the text content. So the equivalent in vanilla JavaScript would be to write document.query selector h1 text content. The point I'm trying to say here is that we're using jQuery because it makes things a lot easier for us. This is going to be a lot easier to use compared to the vanilla JavaScript. So with that being said, I hope you now got the jQuery plugin installed and you got this selection of the elements successfully working. So now I think it's a good idea for me to show you where do we actually run this scraper that we're going to build. Because we're not going to run our scraper inside of Chrome Developer Tools. We're going to run it on a server-side script inside of Node.js so that we can basically deploy it to any server anywhere or run it at any time without having a browser open and manually pasting or typing our commands inside of console tab inside of Chrome Developer Tools. So in order to get started on that, you need to open up Visual Studio Code. Hopefully you already have it installed, and make sure you also have Node.js installed. So in here, go ahead and make a new directory. We can call it scraping intro. And then go inside the scraping intro directory. And in here, you need to run npm init --yes, so you can get npm packages and use them from Node. And then you need to add two packages. You can either use npm install or you can use yarn add, which I prefer to use. Then you can say yarn add request and request promise, and then Cheerio. So let me first tell you about these two packages before we move on. The request package and request promise is two packages that we use to simply download a website. It just downloads a website similar to something like curl, if you know the curl command for just downloading things, or something like wget from Linux. It's just a simple downloader for things. It doesn't parse the site like our browser does. It just downloads the site. And Cheerio is something we use to be able to use jQuery selectors inside of Node.js. So I think it's a good idea just to show you in practice how all of this works. So go ahead and open the new folder you just created, Scraping Intro, inside of Visual Studio Code. Now that you open the folder, go ahead and create a new file. Let's call it index.js. And in here, we need to import the two modules that we imported using yarn add before. So we write const request require request promise, and then say const chereo require chereo. And then we're going to have a main function that we then execute when we run the script. So we can call it async function main, and then we call main down here below. And now inside of main, we do a const where we get the HTML of the site. So we say await request get. And now make sure that you use the URL I provided earlier in the course. So this is making a get request for this URL. Now there's different HTTP methods you can use. You can use something like post or put, update, and so on. The ones we use most of the time just to get a website is .get. So just like you would visit a website, you just do a request.get to get a site. And then we can also save the HTML so we can see the HTML. So we can say const fs to save a file, require fs. And then we can say fs write file sync and say test.html and put in the HTML. Then you can look at what do we actually get from this site if we run this script. Now let's run it inside of the terminal. So I'm going to go into new terminal, and then I will run node index.js. And now you can see it has downloaded the HTML and it has it right in here. So that is the site, that is the HTML that I have on my site over here. So basically it's just getting the page, downloading the HTML. But how do we also get the data or the text that we have inside here, just like we did with our console log here? Well, that is where chereo comes in handy. So we can write something like const $chereo await chereo load, and then pass in the HTML. And now we can select all of the different elements on this site, just like we did inside of a Chrome browser. So we can say h1 here with the $.text, and we can also save it to a variable. So the text I have here, and then we say console log the text, and then we should see the text of this h1 element if I do a node index.js. And there we go. Now we see the text of this element that we scraped from the site. And then of course, there's endless opportunities to what you want to do with this data. Sometimes people want to save it to a database, a MongoDB database, or something like that. Or, well, they just want to save it to a CSV file. There's lots of things that you can do with this data and use it for. But that is basically from top to bottom of how we build a web scraper. Of course, things get more complex along the way, but I'm going to take you through different projects where you can see how we do things. So the reason why we're doing it inside of Node.js in the end, even though we actually did it inside the Chrome developer browser first, is because, well, we're going to run this on a server every once in a while in a timed interval, maybe once an hour. If not, then you have to go back to your computer every once in an hour and paste in the text and code in the browser. You're not going to be able to navigate around or go to. It's not so feasible to write large chunks of code inside of this Chrome Developer Console. So that's why we're doing it inside of request or Node.js. Also, if you have to save it to a MongoDB database, you can't really do that inside the console tab in here. So that's why we test out things. We try to work out what works inside the Chrome Developer Tools. And then once we get, for example, a selector up and working here, which we see is working in the console, then we go into our Node.js code and write it out and execute it and make a actual scraper. So that's a short intro from top to bottom of how you actually build a scraper. You just built your first Node.js web scraper now. Congratulations. Now I'm going to take you through on to the next lessons where we go through different CSS selectors that you can use to select elements. And yeah, so I'll see you in the next section, and I hope you have got something out of this so far. I hope you built your first scraper already now. So in the previous sections, you now learned how to use Chrome Developer Tools, and you learned how to select an element, and how to also scrape it from inside Node.js. Now we're going to move on to the next lesson inside this site here, and we're going to learn how to select multiple elements. So if I go here and inspect these elements we have here, we can see that they are all H2 elements. So how do we select these elements? And how do we get how do we get a list of these elements? So go inside the console, make sure that you have jQuery injected. So click on this one to inject the jQuery. And then let's try and just select the H2 elements. And there we go. Now we have this list we get back, and each of these is the HTML element of these elements we have here. So if I also go and say .text here, we're just going to get the text of all the elements in one string. We can also go and try and print for each of these elements a new line. So we can say h2.each, and then the first parameter is an index, and the second one is the element. And then we can, well, I won't go and make an arrow function, so we have the index and the element here, and then make an arrow function, and then put in a curly brace, and then you can press shift and enter to make a new line. Makes things a little easier to see. And we can say console log, and we can say the $ element dot text, and that's going to print out the text of each element on a new line, and then end with a curly brace and a round parenthesis. So now it is printing each of these elements text inside the console. So that means that then you can save each of these elements into a new object inside a MongoDB database, or a new line inside a CSV file, for example. And again, just like before, we can do the same thing inside of Node.js. So if I go ahead and copy this URL with the lesson2.html instead, paste it in here, and then we can simply delete this line where we create a text. Let's delete that, so we just have the jQuery or the $ we create here from Cheerio, where we load the HTML in. Let's just select all the H2 elements again, and we can do a .each, just like we did inside of the Chrome console. So we can do another parenthesis here, say index element, do a arrow function, then have the curly braces, and then we can do exactly the same thing again. We can say console log $element dot text. And now if we run this inside of Node.js, we should see the same output in the console. And there we go, we see the same output again. And of course, since I am super lazy, I usually just select the code I was fiddling with inside of Chrome Developer Tools, and I just copy that and paste it inside here. So you can just copy that and paste it inside here. And that's it. That's how you transfer the code that you arrived to inside of Chrome Developer Tools into Node.js. And you also saw how you select multiple elements. Actually, as long as the elements have the same tag or attribute that you're trying to target, in this case it's h2, jQuery is automatically going to make a list of these elements for us. So that's how we select multiple elements, and that is how we loop for each of these elements and output their text. So now we learned how to select elements, how to use the Chrome Developer Tools, selecting multiple elements, and make our own Node.js web scraper. Now it's time for me to introduce you to more CSS selectors inside of jQuery. And if we move on to the next lesson here, to lesson 3, we can now see there's 3 elements, h2 elements, but there is one that is a red color. And the reason why it's red is because it has the ID inside the HTML element that is called red. And we up here in the head element with the style, we have a red style with the color of red. So that is how web developers select elements using CSS. They can say that any h2 element should be a color of blue, or they can say this ID needs to have a color of so and so. That's how you style elements in HTML. But we can also use this to our advantage when we want to select elements inside jQuery or our web scraper. So we could say perhaps we only wanted the elements with this red color, which has a red ID. So you would click on this element, inspect it, and you could see, hey, this element has an ID of red, and this is what I need to scrape. So then we could go on to the console and make sure that you have jQuery injected in the side. So we click on the extension here, and then we can select an element with the ID of red. So to make sure that you select an ID, you put the hashtag sign or the number sign in front, and then you have the ID here. So this is the ID of red, and then we can simply say .text to see the text. So now we have selected only the h2 element with this ID, rather than before when we were selecting all of the h2 elements instead. So if you want to be more precise when you select elements, that is one way to do it, is to see what kind of ID does this element have. And so to select IDs in jQuery, we put a hashtag sign in front and then put the ID. Now let's move on to another CSS selector that exists, which is the class selector. Now I'm going to make a note here again. If we move on to the next lesson, you should know that an ID needs to be unique. So if you go and inspect the elements here, we can see that we have 2 h2 elements with the ID of red. So we can see they're both red, but it's not really valid HTML because an ID needs to be unique. So if I go ahead, inject the jQuery again and say $red.text, we only get the first element in the HTML document, because jQuery is built so that IDs, there is only one of those. So make sure, so this is just a little note for you to be aware of, because sometimes web developers do make mistakes and make multiple IDs with the same name, which you are not supposed to. But what if you want to have multiple elements and the web developer wants to have them in one style? Well, then you have something which is called classes. So if you move on to the next lesson, we have classes now. So you simply say h2 class is equal to red in the HTML. And then up in the CSS, we have a dot red instead of a hashtag red. So that is using a class. And classes, that is fine when you have multiple elements with the same class. So if you go inside and make sure to inject jQuery, and then you can say $sign with the dot, just like the CSS we had inside the file, and say red, and say .text. We see we now get both of the elements text with the red class. So that means that classes in HTML and CSS, and also for our CSS selector in jQuery, have a dot in front, and IDs have a hashtag. So classes are with a dot in front, just like that, when we have multiple elements we want to select with the same class. You can also combine these things. You can combine it so that you have both a class and an element. If you click here on select an element to inspect it and hover over this red element here, you can see it says h2.red. We can also use that selector in here, so we can say h2.red and say .text. And then we have selected all of the h2 elements with the red class. Now, one more thing I want to show you before we move on to our first real world scraper where we scrape Craigslist site. I'm going to show you one more thing you can use to select elements inside jQuery, and that is attributes. So if we select this element here, we can see that it has an attribute saying data customer with the customer number here. And let's imagine that we have these two h1 classes. They both have the class of red. So if you only wanted the last element here, the only way to select it is by taking in this attribute as well. So let's see how we can do that. You can simply double click on this attribute here and say copy. Then you can first inject jQuery and then put a $sign and then use single quotes instead and a square bracket first, and then end it with a square bracket, and then end it with a single quote, and then put in .text. So now we are selecting an element with this attribute instead. And notice we had to use single quotes because we had double quotes in here. You could also switch it around so that you have double quotes here and single quotes in here, as long as you are consistent about it. So that's how you select elements with an attribute. If you don't want to make it for an attribute with a particular value like this one, and you just want to select all elements with this attribute, you can simply say $sign and say data customer, and then say .text. So now you select all the elements with this attribute and not just the ones with the specific value. So now I think it's been enough practice on my little local sites, and I think we should try and have fun with an actual real world site such as Craigslist. So I'll see you in the next sections, and I hope you have lots of fun with this.